Upon meeting the new cook at the mansion, the millionaire was tormented to recognize his great love from his youth. She disappeared 20 years ago. The steady hum of the private jet's engines had been soothing during the long flight back to Boston. Daniel Brooks leaned back in his leather seat, his sharp suit still immaculate after hours of travel, his gaze fixed on the city lights sprawling beneath him, glowing like a constellation against the dark canvas of the earth. The business trip had been a success. As always, deals sealed, assets secured, and rivals outmaneuvered. Daniel was a man who thrived on precision and control. Yet, as the plane descended, a strange heaviness settled over him. Returning home was routine, but it had never been a comfort. The car ride to his estate was quiet. The chauffeur attempted small talk, mentioning the weather and traffic, but Daniel only nodded absentmindedly, his thoughts elsewhere. The mansion loomed in the distance, a grand silhouette against the night sky, its lights like beacons of wealth and solitude. As the gates opened, the quiet hum of the motor heightened the stillness in Daniel's mind. His phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking the silence. He glanced at it, a reminder of tomorrow's board meeting. Work never stopped. Stepping into the house, Daniel was greeted by the familiar scent of polished mahogany and the faint aroma of jasmine candles. The soft lighting bathed the grand foyer in a golden glow. Claudia, his efficient and ever-reliable assistant, appeared at the door, holding a folder of documents. "Welcome back, Mr. Brooks," she said crisply. "Everything is prepared for tomorrow's meeting. Your notes are in the study. Oh, and we hired a new cook while you were away. Her references were excellent." Daniel barely acknowledged her words. "Fine. Make sure the reports are ready by morning," he replied, already heading toward his study. Yet, as he passed the kitchen, a faint sound made him pause. The delicate clink of a spoon against a pot echoed softly through the quiet house. Daniel turned his head, curious. The staff usually retired early, and he wasn't accustomed to hearing activity at this hour, driven by a flicker of intrigue. He stepped into the kitchen, and then he stopped, his breath catching in his throat. A woman stood by the stove, her back to him. Her movements were deliberate yet unhurried as she stirred something in a pot. The soft glow of the overhead light outlined her silhouette, a figure vaguely familiar, yet utterly shocking in this context. Allison. The name escaped his lips before he could stop himself. The woman stiffened. Slowly, she turned, and when her eyes met his, Daniel felt the ground shift beneath him. It was her, Allison Hayes, the woman he had once loved with every fiber of his being, the woman who had vanished from his life 20 years ago without a trace. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Her eyes, guarded yet intense, held his gaze. She looked older, her features sharpened by time and hardship. There were faint lines around her mouth, and a thin scar ran along her jawline, but it was unmistakably her. "Mr. Brooks," she said finally, her voice steady but devoid of warmth. "I didn't expect you back tonight." Daniel took a step closer, his heart pounding. What are you doing here?" His voice was low, almost a whisper. "I work here," she replied simply, turning back to the pot. "I'm the new cook." The words felt like a slap. Cook, in his house. How was that possible? How had she ended up here? Of all places, 1,000 questions flooded his mind. But all he could manage was, "Why didn't you tell me?" Allison didn't answer immediately. She focused on ladling soup into a bowl, her hands steady. Finally, she turned to face him again. "There's nothing to tell, Mr. Brooks. It's just a job." Her words, cold and detached, cut deeper than he expected. This was not the Allison he remembered, the vibrant, fiery woman who had once defied the world to be with him. Daniel's chest tightened. "Don't do that," he said, his voice firm. "Don't act like we don't have history." Allison's eyes flickered with something, pain perhaps, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "That was a long time ago," she said quietly. "Things change. People change." He took another step closer, his voice softening. "Not everything. I need to understand. What happened? Why did you leave?" Her hand tightened around the ladle, her knuckles whitening. For a moment, Daniel thought she might answer, but instead she shook her head. "It's late, Mr. Brooks. You should get some rest," before he could respond. She turned off the stove, wiped her hands on a towel, and walked past him, her footsteps echoing softly in the quiet house. Daniel stood there, rooted to the spot, his mind racing. Allison Hayes was back in his life, but she was a stranger now, a shadow of the woman he once knew. And yet, something in her eyes told him there was more to the story. He wasn't sure how, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let her slip away again. Daniel couldn't sleep. He lay in his oversized bed, staring at the ceiling as the events of the evening replayed endlessly in his mind. Allison Hayes. The name alone carried the weight of 2 decades of unresolved emotions. The way she had stood there, calm and composed, as if she hadn't shattered his world all those years ago. How could she act as though nothing had happened? He turned on the bedside lamp and reached for the glass of water on the nightstand, but his hand trembled slightly. That wasn't like him. Daniel Brooks, the ever-calm, ever-controlled businessman, was rarely shaken. Yet tonight, the sight of Allison had cracked the armor he had built around his heart. Memories surfaced unbidden, vivid and raw. He was 23, reckless and passionate, and she was the only thing in his world that mattered back then. Allison worked as a waitress at a small diner near his family's summer estate. Her laughter had been infectious, her smile radiant, and her spirit unbreakable. They met by chance, but it didn't take long for him to fall hard. Their love was the kind that burned brightly, the kind that ignored social boundaries and the expectations of others. She was from a modest background, while he was the heir to the Brooks empire. His family disapproved, of course. His father, Walter Brooks, had been particularly ruthless in his disdain for Allison, calling her a distraction, a phase that Daniel would soon outgrow. But Daniel had been stubborn. Defiant, he remembered sneaking away from the grand galas his family hosted, choosing instead to spend hours with Allison at the edge of the lake, where they'd dream about a life far from the constraints of his family's wealth and power. He could still picture her, sitting on the dock with her feet dangling over the water, her laughter filling the air as she teased him about his terrible rowing skills. For someone who's supposed to run empires, you can't even keep a boat straight, she joked, her eyes sparkling. The memory made him smile, but it was fleeting, quickly replaced by the darker ones. It was a rainy night, the kind where the skies seemed to mourn along with him. He had waited for hours at the diner where they always met, expecting her to show up like she always did, but Allison never came. He called her, but there was no answer. He went to her small apartment, but it was empty. She was gone, for weeks. He searched for her, using every resource at his disposal, but there was no trace of Allison Hayes. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. Eventually, the pain turned into anger. He convinced himself that she had left him, that she hadn't been strong enough to fight for what they had. It was the only way to move forward. But now, seeing her again, so close yet so distant, every assumption he had made about her disappearance was unraveling. There was something in her eyes tonight, something she wasn't saying. Daniel threw off the covers and walked to the window. The city stretched out before him, its lights twinkling like stars. He had built an empire, just as his father had always wanted. Yet standing there, he felt an emptiness he hadn't acknowledged in years. Allison's return had stirred something in him, something he wasn't sure he could control. The next morning, Daniel arrived in the dining room earlier than usual. The table was already set, and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air. Allison moved around the kitchen with practiced ease. Her back turned to him. He cleared his throat, and she glanced over her shoulder, her expression neutral. "Good morning, Mr. Brooks. Breakfast will be ready shortly." "We need to talk," he said, his tone firm. "I'm working," she replied, not looking at him. Daniel took a step closer, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "This isn't just about work, and you know it. Why are you here, Allison? Why now?" She set down the spatula she was holding and turned to face him, her eyes locking onto his. "I needed a job. That's all there is to it." "Don't lie to me," he said, his voice lowering. "You disappeared without a word, and now you're back in my house like nothing happened. I deserve an explanation." For a moment she looked as if she might respond, but then her expression hardened. "Not everything is about you. Daniel, people make choices, they move on." Her words stung, but he refused to back down. "Did you move on, Allison? Because from where I'm standing, it doesn't look like you did." Her jaw tightened, and she turned back to the stove, effectively ending the conversation. Daniel clenched his fists. his frustration palpable. He wasn't used to being stonewalled, especially not by her. He needed answers, and he wasn't going to stop until he got them. As he left the kitchen, one thought echoed in his mind. Allison Hayes was hiding something, and whatever it was, it had the power to change everything he thought he knew about the past. Daniel's frustration lingered throughout the morning. He couldn't focus during his usual routines, calls with board members, updates on quarterly projections, or even the new acquisition strategy for one of his companies. His mind was elsewhere, trapped in the past and haunted by Allison's reappearance. By the time lunch came around, Daniel had made up his mind. He needed answers, and if Allison wasn't going to give them willingly, he would find them himself. Seated in his study, Daniel leaned back in the leather chair, his fingers drumming against the desk. He opened his laptop and began typing. It started with her name, Allison Hayes, searching public records. He found her birth date, old addresses, and job histories. Most of it was unremarkable, but there was a glaring gap in the timeline, about a year after she disappeared. "What were you doing during that time?" he muttered to himself. Scrolling through the sparse details, the more he searched, the more questions surfaced. There were no signs of her marrying or significant ties to anyone else. It seemed as though Allison had lived a quiet, almost invisible life, moving between modest jobs, never staying in one place for too long. But there was one record that caught his attention. A hospital admission from 2 decades ago in a small town 2 states away. The timing aligned perfectly with her disappearance. Daniel's pulse quickened as he read the details. An emergency room visit for stress-related complications. Why had she been in that hospital? And why had she been under such stress? The knock on his study door startled him. He closed the laptop quickly, his expression snapping back to the composed mask he always wore. Claudia stepped in, holding a folder. "Your 2 o'clock meeting has been rescheduled to later this evening. Also, you have a call waiting from Mr. Whitaker regarding the new partnership terms." "Tell Whitaker I'll call him back in an hour," Daniel replied. His tone clipped. Claudia hesitated. "Is everything all right, Mr. Brooks?" Daniel waved her off. "Fine. Just a lot on my mind." Once the door closed, Daniel reopened the laptop and stared at the hospital record again. He leaned forward, his determination hardening. There was more to this story, and he wasn't going to stop until he uncovered the truth. That evening, Daniel waited until the house was quieter. The staff had mostly retired, and the air felt still, save for the occasional creak of the old mansion settling into itself. He made his way to the kitchen, where he found Allison cleaning up. She glanced at him as he entered, but didn't speak. Daniel leaned against the counter, watching her for a moment before breaking the silence. "I've been thinking about what you said this morning," he began, his voice calm but probing. "About people moving on." She didn't stop what she was doing. "It's a natural part of life, Daniel. Some of us don't have the luxury of dwelling on the past. Don't you?" he asked pointedly. "Because you're standing in my house, working in my kitchen. That doesn't seem like moving on to me." Her hands paused, gripping the edge of the sink. Slowly, she turned to face him. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice weary. "The truth," he replied without hesitation. Allison's expression hardened. "The truth won't change anything. You've built a life for yourself, Daniel. A life that doesn't include me. Let it stay that way." He took a step closer, his frustration surfacing again. "You don't get to decide that for me. Not after everything we—" He stopped himself, taking a deep breath to steady his emotions. "Not after you left without a word." Her gaze faltered for the briefest moment, and Daniel caught it. She was hiding something, and he was determined to find out what it was. "Allison," he said softly, his voice carrying a rare vulnerability. "I need to know why. Why did you leave? Was it something I did? Something I didn't do?" She looked at him, and for the first time, he saw a crack in her guarded exterior. But before she could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway. Both of them turned as Claudia appeared, holding a piece of paper. "Sorry to interrupt," she said, her voice uncertain as she glanced between them. "This just came in for you, Mr. Brooks." Daniel took the paper, his jaw tightening as he read it. It was a report from the private investigator he had hired earlier that day, a detailed summary of Allison's life since she'd disappeared. He looked back at her, his grip tightening on the report. "You didn't just leave," he said, his voice low. You were pushed out." Her eyes widened slightly, but she said nothing. Daniel stepped closer, holding up the paper. "This says you were in a hospital, Allison. Stress, exhaustion. What happened? Who did this to you?" Her hands trembled slightly, but she folded them in front of her to steady herself. "You don't know what you're talking about," she said quietly. "Don't I?" he shot back. "Because it sounds a lot like someone forced you to disappear. Who was it? Was it my father?" Allison's face paled at the mention of Walter Brooks. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Daniel stared at her, his heart pounding. "You don't have to protect him," he said softly. "If it was him, I need to know." She turned away, shaking her head. "It's not that simple, Daniel." But her reaction told him everything he needed to know. The tension in the kitchen was palpable, a silence hanging in the air thick enough to cut. Daniel watched Allison carefully, searching for any hint of confirmation in her body language. Her rigid posture, the slight quiver of her hands, everything pointed to one truth she wasn't ready to admit. "Allison," he said softly, his voice now carrying an edge of desperation. "If my father was involved, you have to tell me. I deserve to know." Allison let out a shaky breath, her fingers tightening on the edge of the counter as if bracing herself. Slowly, she turned to face him, her eyes heavy with a mixture of defiance and resignation. "You don't deserve to know," she said, her voice low. "You deserved to know 20 years ago. But I wasn't given a choice." Daniel's chest tightened, a bitter mix of anger and guilt rising inside him. "What did he do?" Allison hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line as she fought an internal battle. Finally, as if the weight of the secret had become too much, she spoke. "He came to see me," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "One night, after we'd spent the day together by the lake, I thought you'd told him about us, that maybe he wanted to talk." Daniel's stomach twisted. He could already imagine his father's imposing figure, his calculated, icy demeanor. "But he didn't come to talk," Allison continued, her voice sharpening with the bitterness of old wounds. "He came to warn me. He said I was ruining your future, that I was a distraction you couldn't afford, and if I didn't leave, he would destroy me." Daniel's hands clenched into fists. "Destroy you? How?" "He threatened my family," Allison said, her voice breaking slightly. "My father was in debt, and my younger sister was just a kid. He said he'd make sure they suffered if I stayed in your life." Daniel felt as if the air had been knocked out of him. His father's cruelty had always been evident in his business dealings. But this was beyond anything he'd imagined. "So you left," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I didn't have a choice. I packed what little I had and disappeared that night." Daniel took a step closer, his voice thick with emotion. "You could have told me. I would have protected you. We could have faced him together." Allison shook her head. "You don't understand, Daniel. He wasn't just threatening me. He was threatening everyone I loved. I couldn't take that risk." He stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. For years, he had believed she'd abandoned him, that she hadn't loved him enough to stay. But now, the truth painted a different picture, one of sacrifice and heartbreak. "And the hospital?" he asked after a moment. Allison hesitated again, but this time, her reluctance was tinged with something else. She glanced down, her hands fidgeting nervously. "I was pregnant," she admitted finally, her voice barely audible. Daniel's breath hitched. He hadn't been prepared for that. "You were..." "I found out a few weeks before I left," she interrupted, her tone defensive as if bracing for judgment. "I didn't know what to do. I was scared, and when your father came to me, I knew I couldn't stay. I went to the hospital because the stress, it was too much." Daniel's mind reeled, the pieces falling into place. "Where is the child?" he asked, his voice trembling. Allison lifted her chin, her eyes meeting his with quiet defiance. "He's not a child anymore," she said. "His name is Dylan. He's 20 years old, and he's studying engineering at Columbia." The room seemed to spin around Daniel. 20 years. He had a son he'd never known existed. His emotions collided. Shock, anger, guilt, and an overwhelming sense of loss for all the moments he'd missed. "Why didn't you tell me?" he demanded, his voice rising. Allison's jaw tightened. And what would I have said? That I was raising your child alone because your father scared me into leaving? Do you think he would have let me keep him if I'd told you? Daniel's anger softened, replaced by a deep, aching sorrow. She was right. His father had been ruthless, willing to destroy anyone who stood in his way. I need to meet him, Daniel said firmly. I need to know him. Allison's eyes narrowed. Dylan doesn't know about you. As far as he's concerned, I raised him on my own. He doesn't need the complications of your world or your family's mess. But he deserves the truth, Daniel countered. And so do I. Allison looked away, her expression conflicted. He's happy, Daniel. He has a good life. I won't let you disrupt that. Daniel stepped closer, his voice soft but resolute. I've already missed 20 years of his life, Allison. I won't miss another day. You don't have to protect me from my father anymore. He's not here to control us. She turned back to him, her eyes searching his face for sincerity. Finally, with a deep sigh, she nodded. I'll think about it. But Daniel, if you hurt him, if you even think about putting him through what I went through, I will never forgive you. I won't, he promised. I just want a chance to know my son. Daniel spent the rest of the night pacing in his study, the weight of Allison's revelation pressing down on him like a storm cloud. A son. He had a son. Every time he tried to imagine Dylan, his mind conjured fragmented images. A young man with Allison's sharp eyes and perhaps his own stubborn determination. He couldn't stop wondering what Dylan was like. Was he ambitious? Quiet? Did he share his father's love for strategy and numbers? Or was he more like Allison? Resilient, resourceful, and fiercely independent. The questions were endless, and each one stung more than the last. By the time the sun rose, Daniel had made a decision. He needed to meet Dylan. Later that morning, Allison found Daniel in the living room, sitting with a mug of coffee that had long gone cold. He looked up as she entered, his expression a mix of resolve and apprehension. I need to see him, he said simply. Allison sighed, leaning against the doorframe. I told you I'd think about it. And her lips pressed into a thin line. Dylan's my son, Daniel. I raised him. I protected him. I won't let you disrupt his life just because you feel entitled to meet him now. Entitled? Daniel's voice rose slightly. I'm his father, Allison. I have every right to know him. You're 20 years late, she shot back, her voice sharp. Where were you when I was working double shifts to pay for his school supplies? When he had the flu and cried through the night because I couldn't afford a doctor? You weren't there. Daniel, I was... Her words cut deep. But Daniel didn't flinch. I didn't know, he said quietly, his tone laced with regret. And that's not his fault, Allison replied. He doesn't owe you anything. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with unspoken pain. Finally, Daniel leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. I'm not asking for a clean slate. I'm not asking to erase the past. I just want a chance, Allison. A chance to know him, to be part of his life, even if it's just a small part. Allison studied him for a long moment, her expression softening slightly. If I agree to this, it's on my terms, she said finally. You'll meet him when I say it's the right time, and you won't pressure him. If he doesn't want a relationship with you, you'll accept that. Daniel nodded, his chest tightening with both relief and trepidation. Agreed. A week later, Allison finally called Dylan. Daniel listened from the hallway, his heart pounding as she spoke to their son for the first time about coming home for a visit. She kept her tone light, telling Dylan she had something important to discuss with him. The day Dylan was set to arrive, Daniel found himself uncharacteristically nervous. He stood by the window, staring out at the driveway, waiting for the sound of tires crunching on the gravel. When the car finally pulled up, his breath hitched. Dylan stepped out, and for a moment, Daniel was frozen. The young man was taller than he'd expected, with a lean build and a confident stride. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, and as he turned to grab his bag from the car, Daniel caught a glimpse of his face. It was like looking into a mirror. Dylan's jawline, his sharp features, even the way he furrowed his brows in concentration. It was all too familiar, but there was something distinctly Allison in the way he smiled as he greeted her with a hug. Daniel stayed back, letting the moment unfold from a distance. Allison led Dylan inside, her hand resting protectively on his shoulder. In the living room, Dylan looked around curiously, his gaze lingering on the grand chandelier and the intricate artwork adorning the walls. "So, whose house is this?" he asked, turning to Allison. "It belongs to someone important," she said carefully, her tone hesitant. Before Dylan could press further, Daniel stepped into the room. The young man's eyes flicked to him, and Daniel felt an almost electric jolt as their gazes met. "Dylan," Allison began, her voice soft but firm. "This is Daniel Brooks." Dylan frowned slightly, his expression skeptical. "Okay, and who is he?" Daniel stepped forward, his heart pounding. "I'm your father," he said, the words feeling both foreign and monumental. The room fell into a stunned silence. Dylan stared at him, his eyes narrowing. "What?" Allison stepped in, her hand on Dylan's arm. "It's a lot to take in, I know. I never told you because what?" Dylan interrupted, his tone sharp. "Because it wasn't convenient. Because he didn't care." "It's not like that," Allison said quickly. Daniel held up a hand, stepping closer. "You have every right to be angry," he said, his voice calm but sincere. "I didn't know about you, Dylan. If I had, I would have been there. I'm here now, because I want to know you." Dylan's jaw tightened, his eyes searching Daniel's face as if trying to discern the truth. "And what am I supposed to do with that? Pretend like the last 20 years didn't happen?" "No," Daniel said. "I don't expect you to forgive me or even accept me right away, but I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." Dylan looked at Allison, his expression conflicted. "Why now?" Allison hesitated, glancing at Daniel before answering. "Because it's time you knew the truth, and because," her voice faltered, because there are things you need to be protected from." Dylan frowned, his confusion deepening. "Protected from what?" Daniel exchanged a tense glance with Allison. "We'll explain everything," he said, his tone firm. "But first, let's start with getting to know each other." The tension in the air was almost unbearable. Dylan sat on the edge of the plush leather couch, his body stiff and his expression unreadable. Across from him, Daniel studied his son carefully, trying to gauge his thoughts. Allison hovered near the doorway, her protective instincts clearly on high alert. "So," Dylan began, breaking the silence, his tone sharp with sarcasm, "this is the part where you tell me you're suddenly interested in being a dad after 2 decades of nothing." Daniel flinched slightly at the bitterness in Dylan's voice, but he held his ground. "I'm not going to pretend this isn't complicated," he said evenly. "I don't expect you to forgive me, and I don't expect us to fix this overnight, but I'm here now, and I want to try." Dylan scoffed, leaning back against the couch. "Try what? Building a relationship? Becoming some perfect family? It's a little late for that, don't you think?" "Maybe," Daniel admitted, "but it's not too late to start something new." Allison stepped forward, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Dylan, I know this is a lot to take in, but I wouldn't have brought you here if I didn't think it was important." Dylan turned to her, his frustration evident. "Important for who? For him?" He gestured toward Daniel. "Because it sure doesn't feel like this is about me. It's about both of you," Allison replied firmly. "You deserve to know the truth, and whether you like it or not, he's part of that truth." Dylan let out a frustrated sigh, running a hand through his hair. "Fine. So what happens now? We all sit around and play catch-up like nothing happened." Daniel leaned forward, his voice steady. "I know I can't undo the past, but I want to understand who you are, Dylan. I want to know what you care about, what drives you. I want to be part of your life, even if it's just in a small way." Dylan hesitated, his gaze flickering between Daniel and Allison. There was a part of him that wanted to reject all of this outright, to walk out and never look back. But another part, buried deep beneath the anger, was curious. "What do you even know about me?" Dylan asked finally, his tone softer but still guarded. "Not enough," Daniel admitted, "but I'd like to change that." Over the next few hours, the conversation remained cautious, with both Dylan and Daniel navigating the rocky terrain of their new reality. Allison stayed close, occasionally stepping in to redirect the conversation when emotions ran too high. Dylan spoke hesitantly about his life, his studies at Columbia, his passion for problem-solving, and his dreams of designing systems that could revolutionize infrastructure. Daniel listened intently, Surprised and impressed by his son's intellect and ambition. "You're studying engineering?" Daniel asked at one point, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Yeah," Dylan replied, shrugging. "Why? It's just interesting," Daniel said, his tone thoughtful. "I majored in business, but I always had a fascination with systems and efficiency. I guess we have more in common than I thought." Dylan raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "Yeah, sure, because building a corporate empire is just like designing sustainable water systems." Daniel chuckled softly. "Fair enough, but the principles aren't so different. Understanding how things work, finding the best way to make them function. It's all about problem solving." Dylan didn't respond immediately, but the faintest hint of a smile crossed his face before he quickly masked it. By the time the evening rolled around, the atmosphere in the room had shifted slightly. The tension wasn't gone, but it had eased enough to allow for small moments of connection. As Allison cleared away the coffee cups, Dylan glanced at Daniel, his expression hesitant. "So, what's your deal?" he asked suddenly. Daniel looked at him, slightly taken aback. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you're obviously rich," Dylan said, gesturing around the lavish living room. "What do you actually do, besides sit around in suits and look important?" Daniel couldn't help but laugh at the bluntness of the question. "I run a company," he explained. "Brooks Enterprises. We specialize in investments, acquisitions, and restructuring struggling businesses." Translation: "You're a corporate shark," Dylan said, his tone dry. "Something like that," Daniel admitted, a faint smirk on his face. Dylan studied him for a moment, as if trying to reconcile the man before him with the image he'd built up in his mind. "And you're really my dad," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. "Yes," Daniel said softly. The room fell silent again, but this time, the quiet felt less heavy. Later that night, after Dylan had gone to bed, Daniel found Allison in the kitchen, tidying up. "Thank you," he said, his voice sincere. "For what?" she asked, not looking up. "For giving me this chance," he replied. "I know it wasn't easy." Allison paused, setting down the dish she was holding. She turned to face him, her expression guarded. "I'm not doing this for you, Daniel. I'm doing it for Dylan. He deserves to know where he comes from, even if it complicates things." "I understand," Daniel said, "but I mean it." "I'm grateful." Allison studied him for a moment before nodding. "Just don't mess this up," she said quietly. "He's been through enough." "I won't," Daniel promised. As Allison turned back to the sink, Daniel stepped out of the kitchen, his mind racing with thoughts of the day. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of hope, not just for himself, but for the family he was beginning to discover. The next morning, Daniel sat in his study, staring blankly at the financial reports spread across his desk, numbers and charts, usually comforting in their precision, now blurred together as his thoughts drifted elsewhere. He had spent the last 24 hours trying to process everything. Allison's sacrifices, Dylan's guarded hostility, and the years of fatherhood he had unknowingly missed. A soft knock on the door pulled him from his reverie. "Come in," he said, his tone distracted. Claudia entered, holding a small envelope. "This arrived for you earlier, Mr. Brooks. It's marked urgent." Daniel frowned, taking the envelope. It was unmarked, save for his name written in an elegant, unfamiliar script. Breaking the seal, he unfolded the letter inside. The contents made his blood run cold. The letter was from Walter Brooks's attorney. It was brief, but heavy with implication. Walter wanted to see Daniel immediately. Hours later, Daniel stood outside his father's estate, a place he had avoided since the elder Brooks's health began to decline. The once imposing mansion now seemed diminished, its grandeur overshadowed by the weight of its owner's fading legacy. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of antiseptics and the hum of medical equipment. Walter lay in a massive bed, his once imposing frame now frail and gaunt. His sharp blue eyes, however, retained their familiar intensity as they locked onto Daniel. "You finally came," Walter rasped, his voice weak but laced with its usual authority. "I didn't realize I had a choice," Daniel replied, his tone cool. Walter chuckled dryly, the sound more of a cough. "Always the defiant one. Sit down, we have things to discuss." Reluctantly, Daniel pulled up a chair beside the bed, For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence heavy with years of unresolved tension. "You've been busy," Walter began, his eyes narrowing, "bringing that woman and her son into your life." Daniel stiffened. "Her name is Allison, and he's not just her son, he's my son." Walter let out a wheezing sigh. "I always knew she'd come back to haunt us." "You mean haunt you?" Daniel shot back, hot, his voice rising. "She didn't leave because she wanted to. You forced her out. You threatened her family, didn't you?" Walter didn't deny it. Instead, he leaned back against the pillows, his expression unreadable. "It was necessary. You were young, reckless. She would have dragged you down. Dragged me down." Daniel's voice was sharp with disbelief. "She loved me. We could have been happy. But you took that from us." Walter's eyes flashed with something. Anger, regret, perhaps both. "You think this is about love? You think I enjoyed doing what I did? I was protecting this family?" Daniel stood, his hands clenched into fists. "From what? From a woman who only wanted to be part of my life? Or was it from your own fear of losing control?" Walter's silence was damning. After a moment he spoke again, his voice quieter. "It doesn't matter now. What's done is done. But there's something you need to know. Something bigger than your grievances against me." Daniel frowned, his anger momentarily tempered by curiosity. "What are you talking about?" Walter's hand trembled as he reached for a stack of papers on the bedside table. He handed them to Daniel, his gaze steady despite his weakening body. "This, read it." Daniel scanned the documents, his confusion deepening with every line. They detailed a series of financial transactions, obscure deals, and, at the center of it all, the name of a man Daniel had never heard before. Travis. "Who is Travis?" Daniel asked, his voice sharp. Walter hesitated, his jaw tightening. "He's your brother." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Daniel stared at his father, his mind racing. "What the hell are you talking about? I don't have a brother." "You do," Walter said firmly. "He's the result of a mistake I made a long time ago. I had an affair, and Travis was born out of it." Daniel's stomach churned. "You kept this a secret all these years." "It was for the best," Walter said. "He was raised far from this family. But now he's back, and he's dangerous." "Dangerous how?" Daniel demanded. Walter's expression darkened. "He blames me, blames us, for the life he had. He's been making moves against Brooks Enterprises for months, pulling strings behind the scenes. And now that Dylan is in the picture, he's targeting Dylan," Daniel finished, the realization hitting him like a freight train. Walter nodded. "He sees Dylan as the next generation of this family, the heir to everything he believes was stolen from him. If you're not careful, he'll destroy everything, and everyone you care about." Daniel's jaw tightened, his anger toward his father momentarily overshadowed by a surge of protectiveness. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I'm dying," Walter said simply, "and because, for all my faults, I don't want my mistakes to destroy this family." Daniel stood, the papers still clutched in his hand. His mind raced with questions, plans, and an overwhelming sense of urgency. He looked down at his father, a man he had spent his life resenting, and for the first time, he saw fear in his eyes. "I'll handle it," Daniel said finally, his voice steady. "But this doesn't absolve you of what you've done." Walter nodded weakly, his eyes closing as exhaustion overtook him. "Do what you have to do. Protect them." Daniel left the room, his mind spinning. He had come seeking closure, but had found something far more dangerous. A brother he never knew he had, and a threat to the family he was just beginning to rebuild. The drive back to his mansion felt longer than usual. Daniel gripped the steering wheel tightly, his thoughts racing as he tried to process what he had just learned. A brother, another Brooks, and not just any brother, but one driven by resentment and revenge. As the gates of his estate came into view, Daniel felt a renewed sense of urgency. Walter's warning had left no room for doubt. Dylan was in danger, and Daniel couldn't afford to waste another second. Inside, the house was quiet. Daniel found Allison in the kitchen, chopping vegetables with the same calm efficiency she always seemed to carry. She glanced up as he entered, immediately sensing the tension in his posture. "What happened?" she asked, setting the knife down. Daniel didn't answer right away. Instead, he poured himself a glass of water, his mind still reeling from the conversation with Walter. Finally, he turned to her. "We need to talk." Allison crossed her arms, her expression cautious. "What now?" He leaned against the counter, his voice low but firm. "There's something you don't know. Something I just found out. Dylan might be in more danger than we thought." Her eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" Daniel hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "My father, he had another son, a son no one knew about. His name is Travis, and he's been working against our family for months. Walter says he's dangerous, and that he's targeting Dylan." Allison stared at him, her disbelief evident. "Another son? Are you serious?" "I didn't believe it either," Daniel admitted. "But the evidence is there. Walter showed me documents, transactions, deals Travis has been orchestrating to undermine the company. He's been waiting for the right moment to strike. And now that Dylan is in the picture, he sees him as a threat." Allison's grip tightened on the counter. "So, what are you going to do about it?" Daniel's jaw set with determination. "Whatever it takes to protect Dylan." Later that evening, Daniel called Dylan into his study. The young man entered reluctantly, his expression a mix of curiosity and skepticism. "What's this about?" Dylan asked, taking a seat across from Daniel's desk. Daniel took a deep breath. "There's something I need to tell you. Something important. It's about the family." Dylan raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "What now?" "Another long-lost relative." Daniel's silence was answer enough. Dylan leaned back in his chair, his expression incredulous. "You're kidding me." "I wish I were," Daniel said. "But it's true. His name is Travis, and he's been working against us, against you, against me." Dylan's tone sharpened. "Why would he care about me?" "Because you're my son," Daniel replied. "And in his eyes, that makes you the next heir to everything he believes was taken from him." Dylan scoffed. "Great. So now I have some bitter half-brother out there gunning for me. That's just perfect. I'm not going to let anything happen to you," Daniel said firmly. Dylan leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "And what exactly are you going to do about it? You think you can just throw money at the problem and make it go away?" "It's not that simple," Daniel admitted. "But I have resources. People I trust will figure out a way to deal with him." Dylan shook his head, frustration evident. "This is insane. I didn't ask for any of this." "I know," Daniel said softly. "But this is the reality we're dealing with now. Whether you like it or not, you're part of this family, and that makes you a target." Dylan stood abruptly, pacing the room. "You know what's funny? For 20 years, I didn't even know you existed. And now, suddenly, I'm part of this big, dysfunctional mess. How am I supposed to deal with that?" Daniel watched him carefully, understanding the weight of what Dylan was feeling. "You're not alone in this," he said finally. "We'll face it together." Dylan stopped pacing, turning to look at him. For a moment, he seemed to consider Daniel's words, but his expression remained guarded. "I don't even know if I can trust you," he said quietly. "You don't have to trust me," Daniel replied. "Just give me the chance to prove that I'm here for you, that I won't let anything happen to you." Later that night, Allison found Daniel sitting alone in the study, his head resting in his hands. She approached cautiously, her voice soft. "How did he take it?" "As well as I expected," Daniel replied, lifting his head to look at her. "He's angry, confused, but at least he knows." Allison nodded, her expression thoughtful. "What's the plan?" Daniel leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "First, we gather as much information as we can about Travis. We need to know his next move before he makes it. And then," his voice trailed off, his expression hardening, "we make sure he doesn't get anywhere near Dylan." Allison studied him for a moment, her gaze unwavering. "You'd better be ready for this, Daniel. Because if anything happens to Dylan—" "It won't," Daniel interrupted, his tone resolute. "I won't let it." As the house settled into silence, Daniel's mind raced with possibilities and contingencies. He knew the battle ahead wouldn't be easy. But one thing was clear. Protecting Dylan was no longer just a responsibility. It was his purpose. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Daniel's mansion, but the warmth did little to dispel the tension that had settled over the household. Allison sat in the kitchen, sipping her coffee, her eyes fixed on the newspaper spread before her. Dylan, visibly agitated, paced the living room, muttering to himself about the absurdity of the situation. Daniel, standing near the window, spoke quietly into his phone. His conversation was brief but intense, his tone clipped and authoritative. When he ended the call, he turned to face the others. "I've arranged for extra security around the house," he announced. "No one gets in or out without clearance." Dylan rolled his eyes, throwing himself onto the couch. "Great, because living in a fortress is exactly how I wanted to spend my weekend." Allison shot him a warning look. "Dylan, this isn't a joke. If what Daniel says is true, you could be in serious danger." Dylan let out a frustrated sigh, running a hand through his hair. "Yeah, I got that part. But what am I supposed to do? Just sit here and wait for this guy to show up?" "You stay alert," Daniel said firmly. "And you trust that I'll handle it." Dylan shook his head, his skepticism evident. "Right, because trusting you has worked out so well so far." Daniel clenched his jaw, but chose not to respond. Instead, he crossed the room to join Allison at the kitchen table. "I've also hired someone to look into Travis's movements," he said quietly. "If he's planning something, we'll know." Allison nodded, though her expression remained tense. "I still don't understand how someone could hold on to this much hatred for so long. He doesn't even know Dylan." "It's not about knowing him," Daniel replied. "It's about the idea of him. To Travis, Dylan represents everything he thinks he was denied." Allison's gaze softened slightly as she glanced toward Dylan, who was now scrolling through his phone with a frown. "He didn't ask for any of this." "I know," Daniel said, "and that's why I'm going to make sure he doesn't pay the price for my father's mistakes." The attack came later that afternoon. Dylan had stepped outside to get some fresh air, ignoring Daniel's warnings to stay within sight of the house. He wandered toward the garden, his thoughts a jumble of frustration and unease. The estate's manicured hedges and blooming flowers did little to calm him. He was so lost in his own head that he didn't notice the black SUV idling just beyond the gates. The vehicle sped toward the entrance, and before Dylan could react, two men in dark suits emerged, moving with purpose. "Dylan Hayes," one of them called, his voice sharp and commanding. Dylan froze, his heart pounding. "Who's asking?" The men didn't answer. Instead, they advanced quickly, their intentions clear. Inside the mansion, Daniel's instincts kicked in the moment he heard the commotion. He was in the middle of reviewing documents in his study when a faint shout reached his ears. He bolted to the window, his stomach dropping as he saw Dylan surrounded. "Allison!" he barked, already rushing for the door. Allison appeared in the hallway, her eyes wide. "What's going on?" "Stay inside," Daniel ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. Ignoring her protests, he grabbed the nearest weapon he could find, a heavy fireplace poker, and charged outside. By the time he reached the garden, one of the men had grabbed Dylan by the arm, while the other scanned the area, likely looking for reinforcements. "Let him go," Daniel roared, his voice carrying across the grounds. The men turned, their expressions cold and unyielding. The one holding Dylan tightened his grip, using him as a shield. "This doesn't concern you," the man said, his tone low and threatening. "It concerns me when you threaten my family," Daniel shot back, his grip tightening on the poker. The second man stepped forward, his posture tense. "Walk away, Brooks. This is between us and the boy." Daniel took another step closer, his eyes blazing. "You're not touching him." For a moment, the standoff held, the air thick with unspoken threats. Then, in a sudden burst of movement, Daniel lunged. The fight was brief but brutal. Daniel swung the poker with precision, forcing the men to release Dylan. The younger man stumbled back, watching in shock as his father defended him with an intensity he hadn't expected. One of the attackers managed to land a punch, sending Daniel reeling momentarily. But the older man recovered quickly, using the element of surprise to disarm his opponent. By the time the security team arrived, the attackers were subdued, their plan thwarted. Back inside the mansion, Dylan sat at the kitchen table, nursing a scrape on his arm. Allison fussed over him, her worry evident in the way she dabbed at the wound with a damp cloth. Daniel stood nearby, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. His shirt was torn, and a bruise was already forming on his cheek, but he didn't seem to notice. "What the hell was that?" Dylan demanded, his voice shaking with a mix of anger and fear. "That?" Daniel said, his tone grim. was a warning. A warning! Dylan's eyes widened. They tried to kidnap me, and you're calling it a warning. Daniel met his son's gaze, his expression hard. Because next time, they won't stop at trying. The room fell silent, the weight of Daniel's words settling over them like a storm cloud. "Allison," Daniel said finally, his voice softer now. "We need to move quickly. Travis won't stop until he gets what he wants." "And what does he want?" Allison asked, her voice trembling. Daniel's eyes flicked to Dylan, his resolve hardening. To destroy everything connected to this family, and that includes him. The mansion was eerily quiet that evening, the aftermath of the attack leaving an air of unease in its wake. Allison had retreated to her room, needing time to process the day's events. Daniel, however, found himself unable to rest. Instead, he sat in the study, nursing a glass of whiskey as he stared at the fire crackling in the hearth. The weight of the day pressed heavily on him. For years, he had believed himself untouchable, a man in complete control of his life. But today, that illusion had shattered. His family, Dylan, was now at the center of a storm he hadn't fully prepared for. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in," he called, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. Dylan stepped into the room, his posture tense and his face guarded. He hovered near the doorway, as if unsure whether to stay or leave. "Do you need something?" Daniel asked, setting his glass down. Dylan hesitated, his gaze flicking to the fire before returning to Daniel. "I wanted to talk." Daniel gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit." Dylan crossed the room slowly, lowering himself into the chair. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence filled only by the crackle of the fire. "You were pretty impressive out there," Dylan said finally, his tone laced with grudging respect. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "I didn't have much of a choice." "Still," Dylan continued, leaning back in his chair, "you didn't have to do that. You could have stayed inside. Let security handle it." Daniel's jaw tightened. "And let them take you. That was never an option." Dylan studied him, his expression unreadable. "Why? Why do you care so much? You didn't even know I existed until a few weeks ago." Daniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Because you're my son," he said simply. "And whether I knew about you or not doesn't change that. You're part of my family, Dylan. That means I protect you." Dylan let out a soft scoff, shaking his head. "Family," he muttered. "Funny how that word suddenly means something to you now." Daniel's expression softened, a flicker of guilt crossing his face. "I won't pretend I've been the father you deserved, but I'm here now, and I'll do whatever it takes to make sure you're safe." Dylan's gaze dropped to the floor, his fingers fidgeting with the hem of his sleeve. "It's just a lot," he admitted quietly. "All of this. Finding out about you, about Travis. It feels like my whole life just flipped upside down." "I know," Daniel said gently, "and I don't expect you to adjust overnight, but you don't have to go through this alone." Dylan looked up, his eyes searching Daniel's face for sincerity. "What about you?" he asked. "What's it like for you, knowing you have a son you never knew about?" Daniel hesitated, the question catching him off guard. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "It's complicated," he admitted. "There's guilt. So much guilt for not being there when you needed me. But there's also pride, hearing about everything you've accomplished, seeing the man you've become. I'm proud of you, Dylan." The words hung in the air, their weight sinking in. Dylan's expression softened slightly, though he quickly masked it with a shrug. "Yeah, well, I had to figure a lot of it out on my own." "And you did," Daniel said, his voice steady. "But you don't have to anymore." The conversation continued, the initial tension slowly giving way to a tentative understanding. Dylan shared bits and pieces of his life, his struggles, his successes, and the dreams he was chasing. Daniel listened intently, asking questions and offering encouragement where he could. It wasn't perfect. There were still walls between them. Years of missed moments and unspoken words that couldn't be erased in a single night. But for the first time, they were trying. As the hours passed, Dylan's guard began to lower. He found himself laughing at one of Daniel's dry remarks about corporate boardrooms and their endless meetings. The sound surprised both of them, but it also broke some of the lingering tension. "You know," Dylan said, leaning forward, "you're not as bad as I thought you'd be." Daniel smirked. I'll take that as a compliment. Dylan's expression turned serious again. But this thing with Travis, it's not just about me, is it? He's coming after you too. Daniel nodded slowly. He blames me for the life he didn't have. And now that he knows about you, he sees you as a threat to whatever he thinks he's owed. Dylan frowned, his brow furrowing. What's his plan? I don't know yet, Daniel admitted. But I intend to find out. Dylan hesitated before speaking again. What if he doesn't stop? What if he doesn't care about reasoning or making peace? Then we'll handle it, Daniel said firmly. Whatever it takes. As the night wore on, Dylan eventually excused himself, heading to his room. Daniel watched him go, a mixture of pride and sadness settling over him. There was still so much ground to cover, so many years to make up for. But tonight had been a start. When the house finally fell silent, Daniel remained in the study, staring into the dying embers of the fire. His resolve hardened with every passing minute. Travis might be out there, plotting in the shadows, but Daniel wasn't going to let him win. Not this time. The following days were marked by a tense vigilance. Daniel had doubled the security presence around the estate, turning it into a veritable fortress. Cameras monitored every angle. Guards patrolled the perimeter, and no one entered or exited without scrutiny. Yet, despite the precautions, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't enough. Late one evening, as the house settled into an uneasy quiet, Daniel's phone buzzed with an incoming call. He recognized the number instantly. It was from the investigator he'd hired to track Travis. "Tell me you found something," Daniel said without preamble. The voice on the other end was brisk. Travis Brooks has been making moves in the shadows for months, but it's more than just financial sabotage. He's been meeting with individuals tied to organized crime, dangerous people who specialize in resolving disputes. Daniel's grip on the phone tightened. Assassins. Essentially, the investigator confirmed. He's careful, though. Most of his dealings are through intermediaries, but we tracked one recent meeting to a private airfield just outside the city. What was he doing there? Securing weapons, the investigator replied grimly. He's building a small arsenal. Mr. Brooks, whatever he's planning, it's more than just intimidation. Daniel's jaw clenched as the weight of the situation settled over him. Send me everything you have, he said. It's already on its way, the investigator assured him. Daniel ended the call and stared out the window, his reflection fractured by the night beyond. The situation was escalating faster than he had anticipated. Travis wasn't just bitter, he was dangerous, and now he had the means to act on his vendetta. The next morning, Daniel gathered Allison and Dylan in the living room. His expression was grim, his voice firm as he outlined what he'd learned. "So what?" Dylan asked, his tone a mix of frustration and disbelief. "This guy is just out there, stockpiling weapons and waiting to strike." "That's exactly what's happening," Daniel replied, "and we need to be ready." Allison frowned, her arms crossed tightly. "How do you prepare for something like this?" "We're not soldiers, Daniel." "No, but we're not helpless either," he said. "I've already contacted the authorities and shared what we know. They're monitoring Travis's movements. But that's not enough. We need to stay vigilant and avoid giving him an opening." Dylan shook his head, his frustration bubbling over. "This is insane. All of this because he thinks he got a raw deal in life. What does that even have to do with me?" "It's not just about you," Daniel said, his tone softening. "It's about what you represent to Travis. You're the next generation of this family, the heir to everything he thinks he was denied." Dylan's jaw tightened, and he looked away, his hands clenched into fists. "I didn't ask for any of this," he muttered. Allison reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I know, sweetheart," she said gently, "but we'll get through this, together." Dylan didn't respond, but he didn't pull away either. Later that afternoon, Daniel received the investigator's dossier on Travis. Sitting alone in his study, he pored over the information, his anger growing with every page. The reports painted a picture of a man consumed by resentment, his every move driven by a desire to dismantle the Brooks legacy. There were photos of Travis, taken from a distance, his features sharp, his expression cold. He bore a faint resemblance to Daniel, though his eyes lacked the warmth Daniel's carried when he looked at Dylan. One particular image caught Daniel's attention. Travis, standing outside a rundown warehouse, speaking with a man Daniel recognized as a known arms dealer. The caption confirmed his worst fears. Travis wasn't planning to stop with intimidation. His phone buzzed again, this time with a text from the investigator. "We have confirmation. Travis is planning something within the next 48 hours. Location unclear. Stay alert." Daniel's pulse quickened. He didn't have much time. That evening, as the family sat down for dinner, Daniel debated how much to share. He didn't want to alarm Dylan and Allison more than necessary, but he also knew they needed to understand the stakes. "Travis is escalating," he said finally, setting down his fork. Dylan looked up, his expression wary. "What does that mean?" "It means he's not just angry anymore," Daniel replied. "He's planning to act soon." Allison's face paled. "What kind of action are we talking about?" Daniel hesitated before answering. "He's been acquiring weapons, whatever he's planning. It's not just a scare tactic." Dylan's grip on his glass tightened. "So, what do we do? Just sit here and wait for him to show up?" "No," Daniel said firmly. "We prepare. I'm increasing security again, and I've already notified the authorities. But I need you both to be careful. No unnecessary risks." Dylan leaned back in his chair, his frustration evident. "This is insane. I don't even know this guy. And now he's trying to ruin my life." "It's not about you, Dylan," Daniel said softly. "It's about me. This is my mess, and I'm going to fix it." Dylan met his father's gaze, his anger giving way to something more conflicted. "Yeah, well, let's hope you're right." As the night wore on, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something he couldn't fully control. He stood by the window in his study, staring out into the darkness. Travis was out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And Daniel knew that when the time came, he would have to be ready to confront not just his brother, but the legacy of betrayal and pain that had brought them to this point. The day began like any other, with the morning sun casting a golden glow over the estate's meticulously maintained grounds. But Daniel couldn't shake the unease that had been building over the past few days. Travis's impending move loomed over him like a storm cloud, and no amount of preparation seemed enough to dispel it. Dylan, still processing the chaos that had invaded his life, had taken to jogging around the estate grounds to clear his mind. Allison kept herself busy in the kitchen, her movements sharp and precise, betraying the tension she carried. Daniel, however, was restless. He spent the morning in his study, poring over security updates and making calls to his contacts. Every piece of information pointed to one conclusion: Travis was close to making his move. Around midday, the calm shattered. Dylan's shouts echoed through the estate. Cutting through the stillness like a knife, Daniel bolted from his study, his heart pounding as he raced toward the source of the commotion. He found Allison already in the hallway, her face pale with fear. "What's going on?" she demanded. Before Daniel could answer, one of the security guards burst into the room, his expression grim. "It's Dylan," he said breathlessly. "He's been taken." The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. "What do you mean, taken?" he barked. The guard hesitated, his gaze dropping. "We were patrolling the grounds when a van broke through the outer perimeter. They must have been watching for days, waiting for the right moment. They grabbed him during his run and were gone before we could react." Allison let out a gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh my God," she whispered. Daniel's fists clenched, his mind racing. How the hell did this happen? "I increased security for a reason. They knew what they were doing," the guard replied, his voice laced with regret. "We're already coordinating with local authorities, but..." Daniel didn't wait for him to finish. He turned on his heel, his expression dark. "I want every resource we have focused on finding that van, now." In the hours that followed, the estate buzzed with activity. Police officers combed through the grounds, gathering evidence, while Daniel's security team expanded their search. Allison sat on the couch, her hands trembling as she clutched a picture of Dylan, tears streaming down her face. "This is my fault," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Daniel knelt in front of her, his hands on her shoulders. "No, it's not," he said firmly. "This is on Travis, and I promise you, I will bring him back." Her eyes searched his face, desperation shining through. "You have to, Daniel. I can't lose him." "You won't," he said, his tone resolute. Hours later, Daniel's phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. He answered immediately. "Hello. Hello, brother," a voice drawled on the other end. Daniel's blood ran cold. "Travis. Miss me." Travis's tone was light, almost mocking. "I'd say it's good to finally talk, but under the circumstances, I think we can skip the pleasantries." "Where's Dylan?" Daniel demanded, his voice icy. "He's fine," Travis replied. "For now, but whether he stays that way depends on you." Daniel's grip tightened on the phone. "If you hurt him, you'll what?" Travis interrupted, laughing. "Call the cops. Send your security team after me. We both know you don't have the leverage here." "Daniel, what do you want?" There was a pause before Travis spoke again, his tone darkening. "I want what I was owed. The life your father took from me. The inheritance. The power. The respect. All of it. That's not how this works," Daniel said through gritted teeth. "Then maybe Dylan pays the price," Travis said coldly. The line went silent for a moment, before Travis spoke again, his voice dropping to a chilling calm. "You have 24 hours, Daniel. Make a choice, your legacy or your son." The call ended, leaving Daniel standing in the middle of the room, his chest heaving with anger and fear. Daniel spent the next hour devising a plan. He called Allison and the lead security guard into the study, outlining the details. "We're not waiting 24 hours, he said firmly. "I'll negotiate with him, but we'll have a team ready to extract Dylan the moment we have a location." Allison nodded, her expression resolute. "Just tell me what you need me to do." "You stay here," Daniel said, his voice softening. "I need you safe. Dylan needs you safe." She hesitated but eventually agreed, understanding the danger of involving herself directly. That evening, Travis called again. This time, he provided coordinates for a meeting. "Come alone," he warned. "If I even suspect you brought backup, Dylan won't make it out alive," Daniel agreed, though he had no intention of following Travis's orders completely. As he prepared to leave, Allison stopped him at the door. "Daniel," she said, her voice trembling. "Bring him home." He met her gaze, his expression steady. "I will." With that, he stepped into the night, ready to face his brother. And the storm that awaited, the night was quiet. As Daniel drove toward the coordinates Travis had provided, the darkness outside felt oppressive, mirroring the weight in his chest. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, his mind running through every possible scenario. He knew Travis wasn't a man to bluff. His threats were calculated and dangerous. Ahead, the lights of an abandoned warehouse came into view, its dilapidated exterior casting long shadows under the moonlight. Daniel slowed the car and parked a safe distance away. His senses heightened as he stepped out. His phone buzzed. It was a text from his security team, who were stationed a mile away, ready to intervene if needed. "We're in position, waiting for your signal." Daniel tucked the phone into his pocket and approached the warehouse, the faint creak of the wind adding to the tension. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the faint smell of oil. Flickering fluorescent lights illuminated the space, casting eerie shadows on the cracked concrete floor. In the center of the room stood Travis, his posture casual but his eyes sharp. Dylan was nearby, bound to a chair, his face pale but defiant. A small cut on his temple hinted at a struggle, but otherwise, he seemed unharmed. "Daniel," Travis said, his tone mockingly warm. "So good of you to join us." Daniel's gaze locked onto his son. "Dylan, are you okay?" "I'm fine," Dylan said, his voice steady despite the situation. "Don't let this psycho get what he wants." Travis laughed, a cold, mirthless sound, spoken like a true Brooks, full of bravado. "Even when the odds are stacked against you." Daniel stepped closer, his jaw tightening. "Let him go, Travis. This is between us." Travis tilted his head, his expression turning serious. "You're right. This is between us. But Dylan, he's part of the legacy that was stolen from me. He's the future of everything I should have had." "You don't need him to prove your point," Daniel countered. "If this is about the past, let's settle it here and now. Leave Dylan out of it." Travis smirked, taking a step closer to Dylan. "I don't think you understand, brother. Dylan is my leverage, my proof that I can take what I want." Daniel's fists clenched at the word brother, the bitterness behind it palpable. "You've made your point, Travis. Now let him go." Travis reached into his jacket and pulled out a pistol, aiming it casually at Dylan. "Do you think I'm stupid, Daniel? That I don't see through your self-righteous act? You're just like him. Our father. You only care about power, about control." "I'm not like him," Daniel said firmly. "And I don't want this to end in bloodshed." "Neither do I," Travis replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. "But you're going to make a choice, Daniel. Your son's life, or the empire our father built." Daniel's mind raced as he tried to gauge Travis's intentions. He needed to buy time. For Dylan. For the team waiting outside. "Fine," Daniel said finally, his voice steady. "You want the company, the money? Take it. None of it matters to me if it means losing Dylan." Travis raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "You'd give it all up, just like that?" "Yes," Daniel replied without hesitation. "But only if you let him go." Travis studied him for a long moment, the tension in the room almost suffocating. Finally, he lowered the gun slightly, though his grip remained firm. "You're lying," he said, his voice cold. "You care too much about your precious legacy to walk away," before Daniel could respond. Dylan spoke up, his voice cutting through the standoff. "You're pathetic," he said, glaring at Travis. "You think this is about revenge, but it's not. It's about you not being good enough. You're just a bitter, jealous loser who's too scared to make something of himself." "Dylan," Daniel said sharply, his heart pounding. Travis's face darkened, his hand tightening on the gun. "You've got a big mouth, kid," he said, his voice low and dangerous. In that moment, Daniel saw his opening, as Travis's focus shifted to Dylan. Daniel lunged, grabbing a nearby metal pipe and swinging it with precision. The impact sent the gun flying from Travis's hand. Clattering across the floor, Dylan ducked instinctively as chaos erupted. Travis recovered quickly, throwing a punch that Daniel barely dodged. The two brothers grappled, their movements fueled by years of resentment and anger. Dylan, still bound to the chair, kicked out with his legs, tripping Travis just as he gained the upper hand. Daniel took the opportunity to land a solid blow, sending Travis sprawling to the ground before Travis could recover. The warehouse doors burst open, and Daniel's security team stormed in, their weapons drawn. "Don't move!" one of them barked, training his gun on Travis, defeated and outnumbered. Travis raised his hands in surrender, his face a mask of fury and humiliation. As the dust settled, Daniel rushed to untie Dylan, his hands shaking slightly. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. "I'm fine," Dylan said, though his voice wavered. "I told you I didn't need rescuing." Daniel managed a small, relieved smile. "Humor me this once." As the security team led Travis away, he turned to glare at Daniel one last time. "This isn't over," he snarled. Daniel met his gaze, his expression resolute. "Yes, it is." Later that night, back at the mansion, the family sat together in the living room, the adrenaline of the day finally fading. "You could have been killed," Allison said, her voice trembling as she looked at Dylan. "But I wasn't," Dylan replied, "because he didn't give up on me." Allison turned to Daniel, her eyes softening. "Thank you," she said quietly. Daniel nodded, his gaze resting on Dylan. "We're not out of the woods yet, but we're stronger together." Dylan hesitated before speaking, his voice softer than usual. Maybe you're not as bad as I thought." Daniel smiled, the small victory enough to push him forward. The morning after the confrontation with Travis dawned clear and quiet, the kind of deceptive calm that belied the turmoil of the previous day. Daniel sat in his study, staring out the window as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the trees. His thoughts were a jumble of relief, anger, and exhaustion. Travis was in custody, but the damage he had caused, both physical and emotional, would take time to repair. Daniel's focus now was on ensuring Dylan and Allison felt safe again. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in," he called, his voice hoarse from lack of sleep. Dylan stepped inside, his posture more relaxed than Daniel had seen in days. His face still bore the faint marks of the previous day's ordeal, but his expression was lighter, almost hesitant. "Hey," Dylan said, hovering near the doorway. "Hey," Daniel replied, motioning for him to sit. Dylan took the seat across from Daniel's desk, fidgeting slightly. "So, last night was crazy." Daniel let out a soft laugh, leaning back in his chair. That's one way to put it. Dylan hesitated before speaking again. You didn't have to do all that. You know, the security, the planning, risking yourself. You could have just handed over whatever Travis wanted. That was never an option, Daniel said firmly. You're my son, Dylan. No deal, no amount of money could ever be worth losing you. Dylan looked down, his hands clasped together. I'm not used to this, having someone go to bat for me like that. You'll get used to it, Daniel said with a small smile, because I'm not going anywhere. For a moment, the room was silent, the weight of Daniel's words settling between them. Then, to Daniel's surprise, Dylan looked up, his expression open and sincere. Thanks, he said quietly, for everything. Daniel nodded, his chest tightening with a mix of pride and emotion. Anytime. Later that morning, Allison joined Daniel and Dylan in the living room, her arms crossed but her expression soft. We need to talk about what happens next, she said, her tone firm. Dylan frowned. What do you mean? All of this. Travis, the threats, the danger. It's not over just because he's in custody, she explained. We need to make sure we're prepared for whatever comes next. She's right, Daniel said, leaning forward. Travis might be out of the picture for now, but there are always ripple effects. People he worked with, deals he set in motion. We have to stay vigilant, Dylan sighed, running a hand through his hair. Great. So we're just going to live like this, looking over our shoulders all the time. No, Daniel said firmly. We're going to take control. That starts with making sure this family is stronger than ever. Allison raised an eyebrow. And how do you propose we do that? Daniel glanced at Dylan before turning back to her. By sticking together, Travis exploited the cracks in our family. But we can make sure those cracks don't break us. Dylan hesitated before nodding. Okay, but if we're doing this, we do it as a team, no more secrets, no more going off on your own without telling us. Daniel smiled faintly. Deal. In the days that followed, the family began to settle into a new routine. Daniel worked closely with his security team to dismantle any lingering threats from Travis's network, ensuring their safety moving forward. He also took steps to repair the damage within Brooks Enterprises, restoring the company's stability after months of sabotage. Dylan, meanwhile, began to take a more active role in the family's affairs. Though he had no interest in business, his engineering background proved invaluable in analyzing some of the more technical aspects of the company's operations. Allison, ever the anchor, provided the emotional support they both needed. She encouraged Dylan to pursue his dreams while reminding Daniel to take breaks and focus on the things that truly mattered. One evening, as the three of them sat together in the living room, Daniel brought out an old photo album he had found in the attic. What's that? Dylan asked, leaning forward. Memories, Daniel said, flipping open the cover. I thought it was time we shared some of the good ones. The album was filled with pictures of Daniel's childhood, family vacations, birthdays, moments that seemed almost foreign now. That's you, Dylan asked, pointing to a photo of a younger Daniel wearing an ill-fitting suit at what appeared to be a school event. Don't laugh, Daniel said, chuckling. It was the 80s. Fashion wasn't exactly my strong suit. Dylan smirked, but said nothing. His attention focused on the photos as they flipped through the pages. Allison pointed out a picture of Daniel and Walter, their resemblance striking. You really do look like him, she said softly. Daniel's expression darkened slightly, but he nodded. I just hope I don't make his mistakes. You won't, Allison said firmly. Because you're not him. Dylan glanced at his father, his expression thoughtful. Yeah, you're stubborn, controlling, and way too serious sometimes. But you're not him, Daniel laughed, shaking his head. Thanks, I think. As the night wore on, the atmosphere grew lighter, the tension of the past weeks finally beginning to dissipate, for the first time in years. Daniel felt a sense of hope, a belief that, despite the challenges they had faced, they could rebuild. He looked at Dylan and Allison, his family, and knew one thing for certain. No matter what came next, they would face it together. The days turned into weeks, and the Brooks family began to find a new rhythm. The tension that had once gripped the household eased with time, replaced by a tentative sense of normalcy. Travis remained in custody, his network dismantled, but the scars of his actions lingered in subtle ways. Daniel, ever the strategist, threw himself into ensuring the stability of Brooks Enterprises. The company had weathered the storm of Travis's sabotage, but the recovery process demanded his full attention. Despite the long hours, he made a point to prioritize time with Dylan and Allison, determined not to repeat the mistakes of his father. One afternoon, Daniel and Dylan found themselves in the estate's garden, a space that had become a neutral ground for their evolving relationship. Dylan crouched near a flower bed, inspecting the soil, while Daniel stood nearby, his hands in his pockets. "You know," Dylan said, brushing dirt off his hands, "this garden could use a better irrigation system. The layout isn't bad, but the water distribution is uneven." Daniel smirked. "That's your engineering brain talking." "Maybe," Dylan admitted with a shrug. "But it's true." Daniel crouched beside him, studying the area with an unfamiliar focus. "What would you suggest?" Dylan raised an eyebrow, surprised by the question. Seriously, Daniel said. "Show me what you'd do differently." For the next hour, Dylan explained his ideas, sketching rough diagrams in the dirt as he talked. Daniel listened intently, occasionally asking questions. It was a small moment, but it carried a weight that neither of them acknowledged aloud. A father taking genuine interest in his son's passions. Inside the house, Allison watched the exchange from the window, a soft smile on her lips. She had always known that Daniel had the capacity for connection, even if it had been buried under years of ambition and resentment. Watching him and Dylan now, she felt a glimmer of hope that they could truly become a family. Later that evening, as they gathered for dinner, the atmosphere was lighter than it had been in weeks. Dylan recounted a funny story from his time at college, his animated gestures drawing laughs from both Daniel and Allison. "You should have seen his face," Dylan said, chuckling. "He thought the robot was actually going to explode." "And it didn't?" Allison asked, her eyes wide with mock concern. "Not that time," Dylan replied with a grin. Daniel shook his head, smiling. "Remind me to never let you near anything valuable with a soldering iron." As the evening wore on, Allison excused herself to the kitchen, leaving Daniel and Dylan alone at the table for a moment. The two sat in comfortable silence, the soft clink of silverware the only sound. Then Dylan spoke, his tone more serious. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course," Daniel said, setting his fork down. "Why didn't you ever question him, your father? I mean, why didn't you stand up to him sooner?" Daniel leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "It's complicated," he said after a moment. "Walter was larger than life. He demanded respect, obedience, and for a long time, I thought that's what it meant to be strong, to follow his lead, even when I didn't agree with him." Dylan nodded slowly. "But you don't believe that anymore." "No," Daniel said firmly. "Strength isn't about control or fear. It's about standing up for what matters, even when it's hard. And it's about admitting when you're wrong." Dylan looked at him, a hint of admiration in his eyes. "Guess that's something we both had to learn." "Guess so," Daniel replied, a faint smile tugging at his lips. The next day, Daniel found Allison in the library, flipping through an old photo album. She looked up as he entered, her expression unreadable. "Everything okay?" he asked, sitting beside her. "Just thinking," she said softly, turning a page, "about how far we've come, and how far we still have to go." Daniel nodded, his gaze falling on a picture of his younger self with his father. "It's a long road," he admitted. "But we're on it," Allison said, meeting his eyes. "And that's what matters." For a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of the past giving way to a shared determination for the future. That evening, Daniel called a family meeting in the living room. As Dylan and Allison settled onto the couch, he stood before them, his posture confident but relaxed. "I've been thinking a lot about what comes next," he began. "For us, for the company, for everything." Dylan raised an eyebrow. And I think it's time for a fresh start," Daniel said. "A chance to build something new, together." Allison tilted her head, curious. "What are you proposing?" Daniel smiled. "I'm proposing that we rebuild. Not just the company, but this family. No more secrets, no more walls. From now on, we move forward as a team." Dylan exchanged a glance with Allison before nodding slowly. "I can get behind that." "Me too," Allison added, her voice steady. Daniel's smile widened. "Good, because together, There's nothing we can't handle. As the night wore on, the Brooks family sat together, sharing stories, laughter, and plans for the future. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, they faced it as a united front, a bond forged not by blood, but by choice and resilience. The Brooks estate buzzed with quiet activity as the family prepared for a small but meaningful gathering. It had been months since the chaos surrounding Travis's actions had been resolved, and while the scars of those events remained, the family had emerged stronger and more united than ever. Daniel stood in the garden, adjusting his tie as he surveyed the space. Rows of chairs were set up near the fountain, and a long table adorned with white linens and fresh flowers stood nearby. It wasn't a grand affair, but that wasn't the point. "Do I look okay?" Dylan's voice broke through Daniel's thoughts. Turning, Daniel saw his son dressed in a sharp suit, his tie slightly crooked. He smiled and stepped forward, adjusting the tie with practiced ease. "You look great," Daniel said, his tone warm. Dylan rolled his eyes playfully. "Don't get used to it. I'm more comfortable in jeans and a hoodie," Daniel chuckled. "Noted, but today's a special occasion." Dylan nodded, his expression softening. "Yeah, it is." As the guests arrived, the atmosphere shifted to one of quiet celebration. Close friends, trusted colleagues, and a handful of family allies filled the garden. Their conversations light and filled with optimism. Allison moved through the crowd with ease, her natural warmth putting everyone at ease. She wore a simple but elegant dress, her smile radiant as she greeted each guest. When she reached Daniel, he handed her a glass of champagne. "You've outdone yourself," he said, his voice filled with admiration. She raised an eyebrow, her smile turning playful. "You say that like it's a surprise." Daniel laughed, clinking his glass gently against hers. "Touché." As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a golden glow over the garden, Daniel stepped forward to address the gathered crowd. Dylan and Allison stood beside him, their presence a steadying force. "Thank you all for being here today," Daniel began, his voice strong but tinged with emotion. "The past year has been one of challenges, revelations, and growth. It forced me to confront truths about myself, my family, and the legacy I want to leave behind." He paused, glancing at Dylan. "For a long time, I thought legacy was about power, success, and control, but I've learned that it's about something much more important: connection, trust, and the people who stand by you when it matters most." The crowd listened intently, their expressions thoughtful. Daniel took a deep breath, his gaze sweeping over the gathered faces. Today isn't just about celebrating what we've overcome, it's about looking forward, about building a future that reflects the values we've fought for, a future where this family stands united. He turned to Dylan and Allison, his voice softening. "And it's a future I'm proud to share with both of you." The applause that followed was warm and heartfelt, a testament to the support and admiration of those present. As the evening continued, Daniel found himself standing near the fountain, watching Dylan and Allison interact with the guests. Dylan was animated as he explained one of his engineering projects to a curious listener, while Allison charmed everyone she spoke to with her easy grace. "You've come a long way," a voice said behind him. Daniel turned to see Claudia, his longtime assistant, holding a glass of sparkling water. "I couldn't have done it without you," Daniel replied, his gratitude genuine. Claudia smiled. "I've always believed in you, Daniel, even when you didn't believe in yourself." He nodded, his gaze returning to his family. "I finally understand what matters most, and I won't take it for granted again." As the night wound down, the guests began to leave, their goodbyes filled with well wishes and promises to stay in touch. Back in the house, Daniel, Allison, and Dylan sat together in the living room, the quiet hum of contentment settling over them. "Well," Dylan said, stretching out on the couch. "That wasn't terrible." Allison laughed. "High praise coming from you." Daniel smiled, his heart full as he looked at them. "You both have a way of keeping me grounded, and I'm grateful for it." Dylan glanced at him, his expression thoughtful. "You're not so bad yourself, Dad." The word hung in the air, carrying a weight that none of them missed. Daniel's chest tightened, but his smile remained steady. "Thanks, son," he said softly. As the clock struck midnight, Daniel found himself alone in his study, a glass of whiskey in hand. The house was quiet, the echoes of laughter and conversation still lingering in the air. He thought about everything that had brought them to this moment, the pain, the sacrifices, the choices that had defined their journey, and he realized that, for the first time in years, he felt at peace. Reaching for a pen and paper, he began to write, his words flowing easily. A legacy isn't built on wealth or power. It's built on love, resilience, and the people who stand by you through it all. This is our story, and it's only the beginning. With a satisfied smile, he set the pen down and raised his glass. To a new beginning, he murmured.